Thanks for downloading this episode of Cork Talk with me, Tim Atkin. A weekly conversation with some of the most famous people in the world of wine.
This podcast is brought to you in partnership with Noma Cork by Vinventions. Driven by a commitment to innovation, the new plant-based Noma Cork Green Line offers significant improvements in wine closure performance. Thanks to a rigorous oxygen ingress rate, you can decide which cork is best for your wine, whether it's for young and fresh wines or for those with ageing potential.
Mel Knox became a barrel broker, or barrel pimp, if you like his description, by accident when he was working in a wine shop in California. Over the space of a 43-year career, representing such famous cooperages as Taransaud and François Frères, he's worked with many of California's greatest producers and even made a few wines of his own. He's a witty, well-informed and opinionated interviewee, as you're about to find out. Hey Mel, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm really well, and lovely to hear your voice. It's been way too long, and you're in your library, aren't you? I think in San Francisco at the moment.
Yes, I am. Still
One of these...
reading books and buying them and adding to the mess.
I know the feeling, yeah. I bet you haven't got a Kindle, have you?
It broke.
Is that because you threw it at the wall?
Yeah, maybe.
Just tell us at the top of the podcast how you describe yourself these days, because you've had this very varied career, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm consulting for François Frères here in California and the United States, I suppose, which means that I help my successor, Julie Guffey, once a week. It depends. This is the season for when all the French people come over to help us sell barrels. And so first we had Max Gigondet from the Cooperage, who's the general manager, and now Gregory, who's the sales manager for different regions. And so I help out a couple of days a week now.
Yeah. So we could call you a semi-retired barrel broker. I mean, as we're going to find out, you've done a lot more than that. Yeah. I mean, I love the description of your childhood. I mean, you're very well known for your very English, I might say, sense of humour sometimes. You said that you were born in a log cabin made of oak from the Bertrange and Taransaud forests, and you learned to read and write by carving your name on oak trees. Now, I suspect that's not completely the truth. Where were you actually brought up, and was wine part of your upbringing?
I grew up in Olympia, Washington, where I went through 12 years of school. Olympia is what that time was famous for its beer. So it was not a wine community in any sense of the word. And of course, at that time, neither was anywhere else except small portions of the Napa Valley and the Central Valley. It was a beer and distilled spirits kind of country back in the 50s and 60s.
But then you went to university in California, didn't you? You went to Stanford. I mean, did you study law, or is that just a joke saying that you thought about studying law?
Well, I did think about it. Actually, I visited some friends who were going to Yale Law School, and I realized that it was not for me. Who knows? I mean, I think law school, maybe it's one of those things where you think, well, maybe I could have gone to law school, and what would have I done with it? I don't know. I know a lot of people who have become lawyers and doctors who ended up getting into the wine business. And I keep saying, like, well, gosh, all that medical training really helped you, kind of like if the barrel has a heart attack, you'll be right there,
Well, the winemaker might have a heart attack.
Yeah.
Particularly when they get a bad score from a journalist or something like that, right?
Yeah. But I toyed with various ideas, a lot of them involving restaurants, until I realized that the restaurant business is kind of a form of voluntary servitude. You get up at the crack of dawn and you go to bed past midnight, and I wasn't ready for that kind of commitment. And I while I was working on one of my crazy ideas, I got a job driving a truck for this huge wine and liquor store in Redwood City, which is now K&L, very famous. And I had these friends from college who were running the wine department, and they kept inviting me to tastings. And the next thing you know, I was a wine nut. And I ended up getting a job with these people in San Francisco. These people who had a couple of stores, and I got to meet all kinds of people. And wineries were America really changed wine-wise during the 70s. It seemed like every month another fancy winery opened up. We were the first people to sell Domaine Chandon, Joseph Phelps, all kinds of people, Diamond Creek, just a ton of people. And these people loved to entertain and were friends with Gerald Asher.
Gerald, the famous wine writer, Gerald Asher.
Yeah, Gerald wine writer. Yeah. Gerald Asher is an example of somebody where the words wine and writer are not oxymorons. You know, he's really a great writer. And, through him, I met Jancis and I met Stephen Spurrier.
So that's Jancis Robinson, the wine writer.
Yeah, Jancis Robinson, and all kinds of people, and not to mention people in France that he sent me letters to be introduced to and so forth. But these people loved to entertain, and so must have had dinner with Stephen 10 times in the period from 75, 76. And he was going to do this tasting in France. And we just thought, how cute, you know, but everybody helped him. And the next thing you know, everybody was famous.
So this is the Judgment of Paris in 1976, where a bunch of Californian wines were judged better than most of their French counterparts by French people. That was the key thing, wasn't it? And that's what shocked them, because they were all confidently saying, "Oh, I know which is the Latour and the Lafite and the Corton Charlemagne." And then the wines were revealed, and they turned out to be, I don't know, or, Chateau Montelena and things like that, didn't they? Or and Heights, and which were then not as well known as they became, obviously.
And I do think that the tasting sent California in a certain direction. That the winners were the elegant wines that were almost built for current consumption. But later, when they did tastings, the two wines that were just stuffed with tannin at the time, the Ridge and the Mayacamas, really shone much better. But I think it sent California in probably a good thing, because there are all these sayings: wine cold is wine sold, and all these things. People, 99% of all wine that is consumed or purchased is consumed within 2 days. So it sent a lot of us away from these big, powerful tannic wines into more smooth and ready to drink
approachable wines.
Yeah.
Tell me how you moved from wine into barrels. So I loved your description of yourself as a barrel pimp. I mean, so this was a new rather than the oldest profession when you started, was it? Was anybody doing what you were doing in those days?
A little bit. I mean, basically, I have to credit Becky Wasserman here. We were buying wine. Well, one of the guys I work with and a customer started a company where Becky would pick out the wines in France, and Phil would finance it, and my working buddy would sell them. And so I got to know Becky because I had to sell the wines that we bought, and she would stay with us. And one time she had a terrible flu. This must have been about 1980, and I know what it's like. You're traveling on any kind of trip. It's your 2-week vacation to Hawaii, and you start getting ill. You see the whole world ending on you in a way. And so I said, "Oh, don't worry, Becky, I'll sell them for you." And I sold 3 containers in a week. And she kind of looks at me in somewhat of amazement and kind of like, well, maybe we could work together.
And that was it.
Yeah. But so I started working with Becky on barrel sales and so forth. And we did that for 10, 12 years. And then I gradually bought her out of the business. And it really started to grow in the 90s. The 80s were good for me, but the 90s were just ridiculous. Everybody, there was this insane craze for barrel fermented, barrel aged wines,
which
unfortunately has gone away to a certain degree.
I want to ask you about that at the end. But listen, I love reading your stuff. You're deeply, you're a great reader, and you're deeply knowledgeable about barrels, and you wear this learning very lightly in a way. Can you just tell us a little bit about the historic links between wooden barrels and wine? Because they go back a long way, don't they? And I think you were saying at one point they were used to transport fish, right? I mean, lots of stuff, beer, fish, and presumably anything.
Probably before World War II, barrels were used to ship everything. I won't say everything, but, flour, gunpowder, and they say around 1910, over 1 million barrels were made to ship like salted herring. You just think, whoa. And then gradually, plastics and metals, now the idea, for example, of a brewery that has wooden barrels for its real ale is a novelty. But I suppose before World War II, wood barrels were made out of wood.
Yeah.
And of course, wine barrels were used for shipping wine as well as for aging wine. And now the primary uses for barrels are in the spirits business. The bourbon business consumes something like close to 2 million barrels a year of American oak, American white oak, which are used once and then shipped to Scotland, Spain, Asia, all sorts of places for further use. Or tequila, rum, Canadian whiskey, so forth, use these secondhand barrels. And there's a huge business. The François own these cooperages in Scotland to take used bourbon barrels, put bigger heads on them, more staves, and turn them 190-liter barrel into a 450-liter barrel.
Interesting. Just tell us, you mentioned it there about American oak. Which types of wood are used for wine? Is it mostly oak? I mean, you hear about chestnut sometimes and acacia and things like that, but is oak is the main one? And what are the main types of oak that are used?
Yeah, well, first of all, people always say, well, what a friend of mine made something in a cherry barrel. And I always say, don't forget, we have oak forests where you have a group of cherry trees. It's called an orchard. And chestnut is astringent. If it's not, you don't put some kind of waxy thing on the inside of it. We did make 10 chestnut barrels for Mondavi one time, and it was like the wine stuck to the roof of your mouth. And a friend of mine then bought the wine, was working at Bonnie Doon, bought the barrels when they were 10 years old, and worked out pretty well finally. But chestnut is astringent. Acacia has a peculiar flavor, and some people like it. I don't think it'll ever be a big thing. So it's basically oak, which there's a lot of oak in the world. And different oaks, different species of oaks can have different flavors. Quercus alba, which is grown in the United States, is what you get a taste of when you open a bottle of Jack Daniels or a Young Ridge Zinfandel. Quercus robur and Quercus cecile are found in Europe. Quercus robur is a tree that looks like the kind of tree where Robin Hood and his merry men would hang out under, with a big crown and, and that has wide grains and is what we get in like Limousin oak.
So used for cognac and things like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Although it can be very good for wine, but it has more tannin in it, has to be air dried longer to minimize that. And then Quercus cecile or Petrea grows, in France, Hungary, various parts of Europe. And that looks more like, I would say, a Douglas fir. It grows up tall and straight with a small crown. That is primarily, that is the classic oak used for wine these days.
And so do you find that you can actually taste different forests, as it were, when you're tasting barrels? I mean, do you say, I mean, Limousin is easier, as you said, because it's got those wider pores, but, you know, between Vosges and Taransaud, could you taste a wine and say it's a Vosges barrel or a Taransaud barrel?
Maybe when I was younger. But
I know the feeling.
You know, part of it is we did an experiment. Francois did an experiment with Bouchard Perry-Fils over 20 years ago at the International and we did the tasting at the International Pinot Noir celebration in McMinnville. You've been there.
I have.
And we had tight grained and wide grained wood from 3 different forests. And what you see is that if you get tight grained wood from Limousin, it tastes like tight grained wood from the center of France.
Yeah.
Or you get wide grained wood from Vosges or the center of France, it tastes like Limousin. So I think the grain width is more important than the origin of the wood. Now, to a certain degree, the origin dictates what kind of tree grows there. Quercus Cecile does better in drier areas, Robur better in wetter areas like England, you know, or these days, anywhere in California.
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, I was going to ask you, you know, what makes a good barrel? I mean, it's partly grain width, is it? It's seasoning, as it were. It's air drying, all those things. What else is it?
There's a bunch of factors. I think obviously the species of the oak is very important. That if you do dry American oak for a long time, it does start to taste more like French oak. We did we had a cooperage in Oregon where we used Oregon oak, sometimes called Gary oak, which is just it just tastes like well, an Australian said to me, it tastes like Christmas punch, mate. You know, just all those cinnamon, nutmeg qualities, incredibly pungent, and that had its own unique flavor. American oak tends to be very strong in vanillins, to my way of thinking, or coconutty vanillins. French oak or European oak tends to be a little bit more subtle, but they all have their own flavors. But a lot of the flavors of the oak are determined by the seasoning of the wood. You mill the wood, you make it into what we call marin, which is kind of pieces of wood that are eventually going to be trimmed and jointed and turned into staves for barrels, and you set this out somewhere to dry. Well, you're seasoning the wood, not just drying it, and bitter phenolics are liberated, are neutralized, polysaccharides are liberated from the wood, and the wood changes. And where you dry the wood is also important. The Kadar cooperage got an investment from Taransaud and built a new stave mill in Hungary. They were making their wood in a suburb of Budapest, and they were drying the wood there. And they moved, so they built a new stave mill and drying yard closer to the forest, up near the Tokai wine region. They spaced the staves further apart as they were air drying, and they let the wind and the rain come in, and it completely changed the results. That the Hungarian oak had this flavor, as I said before, of Christmas punch or of nutmeg and all those cinnamony things, and all of a sudden it was much more subtle.
So that was the flavor of Budapest you were getting in those.
Yeah, maybe so. I'm not sure whether you got the Buddha or the pest.
Another thing I want to ask is, I mean, do barrel producers have their own sort of thumbprint, as it were? Can you taste a barrel and say, I mean, I think I can say that's a François Frères barrel or that's a Taransaud barrel. I mean, am I being a bit simplistic? I mean, do you see that too?
You know, it's funny. I remember when I sold wine and there were certain centimillions that we would have, and you would taste them and they'd have a kind of a cocoa quality, a bit of a chocolatey quality in the aftertaste. And then I realized that was something they got from Nadalier barrels. Yeah. Don't ask me how, but of course Francois was always famous for its toastiness. And now, of course, we're getting into the third stage, and we've selected the the wood and we've air dried it, and then we make the barrels. And the François barrels a lot of barrels in Burgundy were shaped by heating them over a wood fire. But other coopers used cauldrons of boiling water. This is an old shipbuilding technique. You can heat wood and bend it, which seems, until I saw it, I thought, whoa, that's amazing. You think of people, making horseshoes or something. But I never thought you could bend wood so much. Anyway, they would use a fire. Other coopers would use natural gas. Other coopers would use steam or boiling water. The Dargaud and Jéglet cooperage in de Beaujolais does that. And actually, Mondavi did an experiment about 1975 where they said, well, to Demptos, would you toast the wood or shape the wood using natural gas? And they discovered that kind of what they liked went away,
Which was the toast, which was the fire,
then,
right?
Yours truly stepped into the picture and said, hey, and it was a different time, actually. Selma Long told me a story. It's Women's History Month now, I think, or something like that. And so Selma Long deserves a lot of credit for pioneering women in wine. But she told me that Becky basically just showed up at the cooperage one day with like a small barrel under her arm and just said, somebody just said, hi, could I talk to your winemaker? The receptionist buzzes Zelma, and someone says, sure, why not? And so the next thing I know, actually about 1979, a bunch of us, including Zelma and me and Mike Richmond, who started Acacia, were all in Burgundy together, learning from this seminar that Becky created, and had a lot of fun. But it was a different time. There weren't very many people selling barrels. There were basically Demptos, Nadalier, and Sarug, which is a cooperage in Nuit Saint-Georges. And that was represented by Dick Graff, who became famous for Chalon.
Yeah. Listen, I'm going to ask you something about the chemistry of wine. You've made your barrel, you've toasted it, and you've got a different size or whatever. How well do we understand the chemistry of wine maturation in wood? Are there things that we can't quite explain? I mean, do we understand them better than when you started out in the 80s?
Well, when I started out, there were basically 2 articles in Wines and Vines about barrels, and most of them involved how to stack your barrels or something like that. And that was it. And then 10 years later, there was a plethora of symposiums. There was a big one in Saint-Emilion in 1991, one at San Francisco State in 93, and all kinds of research was done on barrels. And I think the key for barrels, in my opinion, is obviously you want wood that is, well, it depends on what kind of wine you're making. You're making Cabernet, you're trying to tame the beast. If you let Cabernet kind of make itself, you're going to have maybe something pretty tannic. So you're always doing these techniques so that the wine, the tannins polymerize, etc. And I think there you need a wood that is well seasoned, because you don't want to add wood tannins to the wine, or not astringent wood tannins. In Burgundy, on the other hand, which is very made from Pinot Noir, which is a lightly colored grape variety, you probably don't need all that seasoning. You're actually trying to, as Arnold Schwarzenegger would say, pump it up. You are trying to add a little beef to the product. But to me, in the aging of wine, particularly Burgundian varieties, lees contact is really important. We see that the lees have glutathione, which sounds like something you would take for your glutes, but is an actual very powerful antioxidant. And I feel like when you age wine with its lees, even after bottling, it gains something. The wine gains something. Lalou Bise Le Roy of Domaine Leroy, and Romany Conti once said that the lees nourish the wine. And people go, well, what is that? That's one of the peasant things these French people say. But she was onto something, that the lees really enrich the wine. They also act as kind of a buffer, along with the toast, between the alcohol in the wine and the wood tannins, and they help smooth things out.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, what you're saying is that maybe some grape varieties are better suited to wood aging than others? I mean, we talked about lees, we've talked about the age of the barrels, maybe the size of the barrel. I mean, are there varieties that don't need wood at all? I mean, it's probably a bit unfair of me to ask you that. But
well, no, every variety needs oak, and at least 200% new oak. Obviously, we wouldn't want a Gewürztraminer or a Riesling that tastes like a wannabe Chardonnay or white Burgundy. There's a whole category of wines there. As you know, I made a Vermentino with a friend that we used to say it got a kiss of oak, which is when the hose went through the barrel room from the stainless steel tank to the bottling line.
You don't use things like, I was going to ask you this, you don't use oak chips and staves. I mean, are those kind of anathema to a barrel broker? Do you think, oh God, chips, staves, terrible? You know, micro barrels, as they're called in Australia, aren't they?
Quercus fragmentus is a term you'll find in the Oxford Companion to Wine. Well, you know, if you're making wine that sells for under a certain price point, you just can't use barrels, because you have to pay somebody to tend the barrel. You have to have a place for the barrel. Whereas with these barrel alternatives, you can put everything into a 5,000-gallon tank and hope for the best. And actually, when the Oregon project started, we realized that what we had, we would mill the wood, and we would have the bark went to mushroom farmers. The sapwood went to a steel mill. They just needed any sort of heat. The best, of course, the staves we air dried, and then the quality leftovers we bundled and air dried and made chips out of it and sold it. And although the François sold this business, now the guy who runs it, that's his main business, is he makes chips and sells them to huge wineries in the Central Valley here. And you know, it's, what is it the pig farmers say? We use everything but the squeal.
So there's a place for those things, right? Yeah.
Now, obvious. Now, like I think Zinfandel, for example, there's a lot of, once you get past Cabernet, Pinot Noir, and Chardonnay, at least traditionally made in their countries of origin, then you get into arguments. I mean, or differences of opinion. There are all sorts of ways that Rhone wines are made, for example, or Italian wines. You know, Pinot Noir tends to be a variety that just loves oak, whereas Sangiovese is a variety that seems to repel it in some ways.
You've mentioned some of the projects you've been involved with, also when you were selling barrels, and I've met them with you, you know, some of the great winemakers, especially of California. Were there any that you really enjoyed working with? Most of all, I mean, I know Jim, the late Jim Clendenin, wonderful guy, was a great friend of yours. And did you make sure they got the best barrels or not?
I made wine with 4 different Jims. I made wine with a guy named Jim Olson, who I worked with in retail, and when I taught classes at UC Extension. We made a Gamay together. I made wine with Jim Edelman, who really runs Au Bon Climat to this day. He's been running it really for over 20 years with Clendenin and Jim Moore. And of course, making wine with Clendenin was always a lot of fun. That probably was, I made probably the most fun we had, because you know, anybody who's ever been to lunch at Au Bon Climat knows you'll meet this crazy bunch of people from all over the world. Jim would have 15 different wines open, including, of course, Bob Lindquist from Coupé would be there. By the way, it was Jim Clendenin and Bob Lindquist who gave our late friend Dick Ward his nickname of Dr. Dick.
I didn't know that.
There
so
is
Dr.
a man,
Dick at Sainsbury, yeah?
Yes, because there is a man. I never made wine with Sainsbury, sadly, but there's a man, Dr. Richard Dick Peterson, PhD. And so Jim and Bob started calling him Dr. Dick because, and so then he retired for a while. So they made, I think, Dick Graff Dr. Dick, and then they made Richard Sanford Dr. Dick. But finally, they all kind of retired in one way or the other. Poor Dick Ward was left, and so we made him Dr. Dick, and his email address was Dr. Dick at Sainsbury, and I miss both Dick and Jim to this day.
Yeah, so do I. Both dear friends of both of us.
I'm going to a baseball game with David Graves soon.
I'll send him my love.
As soon as the sky's clear. But I was just down at Au Bon Climat, and they're doing great.
I mean, these winemaking projects you've been involved in was sort of something on the side a bit, but you were involved in Oregon at a crucial point, and also you were an early champion of Italian varieties, weren't you? You've mentioned Vermentino, but also Barbera. Did you enjoy that bit of what you were doing, the wine bit, or was it just like a bit of fun and bit of a diversion?
Well, I enjoyed it in a lot of ways. The fun part of wine is making it. The difficult part is selling it.
Yeah.
I was visiting a guy one time, and he had all these wines from my barrel customers there, but he said that our Ici Là-Bas Chardonnay, the wine I made with Clendenen, was too oaky. And as I said to one of the guys who made the wines he was stocking, I said, I had to think, am I making more money from you, Randy, or from wine sales? And I said, shut your mouth. But we did do a lot with Oregon. I did do a lot with Oregon. Not only the project that Clendenen and I did with Oregon Pinot Noir, but with Eric Hamaker, who we made Oregon Chardonnay. And I felt that Oregon Chardonnay, this is from going, say, to the Hospice de Beaune wine tasting every year, tasting young Chardonnay, a month from being grapes or so, and tasting young Oregon Chardonnay, I realized that the Oregonians were kind of giving up on it, kind of like if you had a 2-year-old who couldn't read Proust, and so I got Eric to barrel ferment Oregon Chardonnay, and clonal issues were important. We found a good batch of Draper clone Chardonnay, and we barrel fermented it, put it through malolactic, did all these things that, as Jim Clendenen and I used to say, we stole from Dominique Lafont. And the broker, his broker, who originally was going, oh, don't make Chardonnay, was going like, well, can I get more? And we did very well, and I'm very happy to see that Oregon now is becoming known not just for Pinot Noir, but for Chardonnay.
Interesting. Tell me something. I mean, you once described Robert Parker, the very powerful wine critic in his day in the 90s and early 2000s, as your best salesman. I mean, he's someone who liked the aromas and flavors of certain types of oak, famously so. I just wondered, has that changed? Do you sense that winemakers and wine critics are less keen on those flavors than he was maybe in the time? Did Parker turn people off oak?
Well, I don't think he turned people off oak. Indeed, he gave a talk in 1991 at the IPNC where he talked about his favorite Pinot Noirs from around the world, and I think about 3/4 of them were made in our barrels, and people started lining up at my table. But
so thank you very much.
Yes, and then of course with Helen Turley, he loved the Cabernets she made in Taransaud barrels, and that didn't hurt. And I suppose you do have a group of people who are like, if they taste oak, it's bad or whatever. But I actually think now what we have is kind of what you've had in the UK for a long time, which is a whole bunch of different voices. Not just, we had 2 voices, the Wine Spectator and Robert Parker, And it was kind of boring. So I think people, it's a different world, but there is kind of an anything but Chardonnay movement and things like that. But I mean, when I started in the wine business, we had shelves for Loire Valley wines, Alsatian wines, all the German wines. I think we're getting back to. I mean, I went into a store here one time and it was all Chardonnay and Cabernet.
And now it's much more diverse.
Now we're getting back to a much more variegated world of wine, and I think that's for the good. And the both cooperages that I represented are doing just fine.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Well, I think that's good. I mean, as you said at the beginning, you're semi-retired now, although you're still very, very active.
I did pick a good time to retire.
Yeah, you did. I think you did.
Forest fires.
I want to ask you that.
Shipping problems.
Yeah. What are the biggest changes you've seen in the wine world, in the 30 years? You've been more than 30 years you're involved in it. You started in the early 70s, didn't you? 50 years, really. Not just in California, but around the world. I mean, forest fires, or certainly a greater regularity of forest fires is one of them. What else have you seen?
Well, climate change aside, clearly, countries like Australia and Chile, for example, I don't know if you've ever been to a Spanish-speaking country, Tim, except when you paid for the Argentinian football team. I was beginning to think that your real name was Atkinsalas or something. I see so many posts from you from Spain, and but that we had Concha y Toro was it when I got into the wine business. We had it for $1.99, and actually, the wine was so good. I thought, Josh, I wish I had studied Spanish. And Chile and Argentina have completely changed. The Argentinian wines were just terrible back then. Italy is completely transformed. Wines from Spain and Portugal, or Spain was always making good wines at reasonable prices. So that the whole different. There's so much more to the wine world, and now, of course, people are Greek wines. Greek wines are just Retsina. Wines from Pinot Noir from Germany, and now, of course, we're having English sparkling wine and all these different sort of things.
And what about California? How's California changed?
Well, of course, California was basically the Napa Valley, the Central Valley, a little bit in Sonoma, and of course, Gerald Asher was involved in the development of Monterey Vineyards with Dr. Richard Peterson, which is a huge endeavor to plant grapes in Monterey County, which was difficult in the beginning. They had their problems. The wine sometimes tasted like. They made a dessert wine that, as a friend of mine said, combined your vegetable course with your dessert course. Tasted like sweet canned asparagus. But now, Monterey County is full of. I was just tasting at Pisoni the other day, just a whole bunch of great wines, Morgan, Roar, all sorts of things. There were a few outliers back then, like Ridge and Chalon. And of course, Santa Barbara County has exploded.
Yeah. So are you confident about the future of California, despite the wildfires and global warming?
Well, I have to say that I think if we don't deal with climate change, we're all cooked.
Yeah, and not just in California, everywhere.
Yeah, all over the world. Yeah. And then, of course, there's the fact that wine. There's this generational theory of wine consumption or of any consumables, period. That if your dad drank Watney's, you're going to drink, something else. You're not as a friend of mine said, that if you're watching a focus group and everybody says, oh yeah, my dad drinks cognac, it's time to sell your stock, and get into Armagnac or something. And so we've seen that my generation was a wine generation, and we were kind of reacting to our parents' cocktail generation. And but now cocktails are coming back. Bourbon, which was dead, I wouldn't say dead, but not doing very well 30 years ago, is on fire. So, there is a question of our younger people going to keep drinking wine.
That's I think those are the two big questions, aren't they, really? Anyway, we could talk for hours. But it's been amazing talking to you. I mean, it's so great to see you and to just hear your views about the world of wine and barrels. And I hope to see you very soon. And I'm raising a virtual glass to our two very dear late friends, to Dr. Dick Ward from Sainsbury, and also to dear Jim Clendenin, both of whom left us too early. So, guys,
come to California sometimes. We speak Spanish here. You'll be understood.
I'm looking forward to it very much. Great to see you.
Okay,
see you, Mel.
Take care.
Bye, man.
Bye-bye.
Well, Mel's quite a character, isn't he? And I love the way he talks about and explains the world of wood. Next week on Cork Talk, my guest is Frank Massard from Priorat in Spain. Join me then. Thanks for listening to Cork Talk. If you want to read more reports, articles and tasting notes by me, go to my website, timatkin.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @TimAtkin and on Instagram @TimAtkinMW. See you next week.